As you come in, and are comfortable, not leaving the front row empty. We've had this conversation before, right? The front row also longs for presence. The front row begs for a human being to inhabit it. Thankfully, my walking buddy does that for me every time she's here, which is good because seeing a friendly face right in the front row, very useful. So, my friends, come on in. And to the extent that you're comfortable sitting near other people, I myself came masked, so I, hear that some of us might feel that right now social distancing again is good with numbers rising and all that jazz. Technically, we're supposed to start at 10, so, right, it's gonna be watch the Rabbi move really, really, really fast, because she's gonna do that now. So, if we can just get anybody in the hallway to come on in. Come on down, as they say. All right. I think people are finally collecting. I'm looking for the Reverend Nancy Cox, and she is not in this room. And she promised she would be here for 3 minutes. No, I mean, she promised she would be here for longer, but I said be here for the first 3 minutes. So I'm going to give her a minute to get back in, and I'm going to tell you that it is a little unsettling to go into your ladies' room right now. I mean, it is a little weird to go into your ladies' room and see yourself. Posters in the... Who had that idea? Okay, Reverend Nancy had the idea to put all right, so first of all, I have to say it's probably time for a new picture because there's nothing left of the, okay. But I don't know, you turn around, you sit down, you go, oh my God. All right, so, folks, before we start, even though we have little time, we must have time for what I'm about to say now, so I'm gonna do it. For all sorts of reasons, last week was a painful and awful week for me. It remains that way. I am, as I told one of my students who is here, I have 2 students here with their significant others, and that student asked me, how am I? And the word was fragile. I am fragile. I was also very lonely. And I was lonely in part because I didn't hear the voices of those of my colleagues in Cabarrus County coming and asking me, how are you? How are you doing? The Reverend Nancy Cox was the single colleague in Cabarrus County to reach out to me and ask me how I was. There is a reason that I joke privately about All Saints being my second spiritual home. It's not just because you invite me back here. It's because of who you are. I want you to know what kind of leader you have. What we are facing now, what my community is facing now, is resurgent trauma because we experienced a pogrom on Shabbat, a pogrom where people come into your kibbutzim and your homes and your musical festivals and they slaughter en masse. And what we are also experiencing now are forms of and desires for retribution and revenge. Civilians will pay the price, and they have been paying the price for 40 years. I'm one of those who will ask you to pray not only for my people, but for all the people of this region who are risking their lives by living in this region and who are facing extremism on every side, extremism that we ourselves are now finding resurgent and strengthening in our own country. It is a dangerous world we live in. So I ask you to pray for peace. I also want to give you a bit of a warning. Sorry? This? Yes, well, there we go. She will learn how to use technology someday before she leaves this world. And then those who are left behind, who witness my struggles with technology, will celebrate and say, yeah, she did it. Okay. So I asked not to be introduced. You all know me. You all know who I am. But I also want you to know in advance what we're doing the next 2 weeks, because the posters are somewhat not accurate. They say I'm going to be speaking about race in the Hebrew Bible for 2 weeks, but that is not true. I'll be speaking about race in the Hebrew Bible today. And on next Sunday, I am going to ask you to stretch as far as you have ever stretched with me on any topic I have ever brought. Next Sunday, I'm going to talk to you about how race was created from Bible. And the subject of that conversation will be the first form in which this took with the canon. And the first form that took was in the racialization of the Jewish people. It is rather ironic that I'll be speaking to you about that at this time, but maybe also a good thing. So that will be a tough piece for us to look at. What we're looking at today is going to be tough, and what we're looking at next Sunday is going to be very tough. I ask you just to open your hearts, breathe through these next 2 Sundays, and know that however we end, we always end in the same place. And you know that by now with me, because at this point you can predict it. You know it's going to happen. We will end in love. We will end with peace. We will end with hope. Okay? I'll promise you that. And I think next week I'm bringing my guitar and we're going to sing, because that's good. I should also mention that the Reverend Nancy Cox joined my tiny little community for a service on Friday night, sang with us and prayed with us. So, creating the other, racialization in the Hebrew Bible. Let's just start with some basic stuff about how racialization works and othering works. This is not necessarily about color. That's why what happens next Sunday will surprise you. Racialization has certain kinds of characterizations. Othering has these characterizations. As a longtime teacher of what happens to minority communities in Europe, I'm speaking here now of the Romani peoples, some you might call gypsies, of Muslim peoples and of Jews in Europe. As a teacher who started her BA thesis was on the colonial enslavement in Potosi of indigenous peoples. This has been a long-standing piece for me. And one of the things that comes up again and again and again as one of the steps is the sexualization of the other, the creating of nightmarish myths about the other that have to do with sexualizing them in ways that are, frankly, often demonic. We all know about this, I think, more in the context of what happens with the black community in this country and people of color, where black men have been sexualized as aggressive rapists. Let's just, up until very, very recently in this country, rape was actually defined racially. It was defined racially as what a black man did to a white woman. A white man could get away with rape in this country legally for hundreds of years, right? Because race was the pivotal piece on which that act was defined. Yes, legally, honest. I'm telling the truth. Bestialization and dehumanization of the enemy is a piece we all know, we have all seen. We have seen what happens when the enemy is defined as rodents. There are old documentaries produced by the Nazis that literally picture Jews as rodents, as rodents crawling all over Europe, a map of Europe. Remember, I think some of you will, the Hutu, the Rwandan massacre in which enemies were described as cockroaches, right? So bestialization is a big piece of this situation. And then the large-scale massacre, even turning to genocidal programs of the enemy. And we are going to see, in effect, all of these things, every one of these three things happens in the Hebrew Bible. And by the way, you can find this in the Greek Bible and the New Testament. Yes, you can. Right? So this is part and parcel of our combined heritage with the texts that we call sacred. So, birth stories. We all know the birth story of the two sons that emerge from the incestuous night in which Lot's daughters force him to drink, get him drunk, and when he is no longer capable of knowing who he is or what he's doing, they effectively rape him. For those of you who believe that men cannot be raped, I'll point you to all sorts of literature that proves otherwise. And I will also point out to you that if you reverse this and Lot becomes Sarah, and it is Sarah's sons, you wouldn't think twice about naming it rape, right? So let's be careful what we do about our naming, right? So what are these children named by the biblical author? The first child is named Moav, and that literally means from the father, and the other is Ben Ami, son of my father. The Ben Ami son is the father of the Ammonites, Ammonites, right? And Moab is the progenitor of the Moabites. Everybody got that? So you have already got at the start of their stories a sexualization of the production of their people, right? Bad things happen in the night, dark things, things that are not supposed to happen. This is how these two children are produced. Has everybody followed me so far? Okay. So what happens in the course of the Hebrew Bible? There are statements made about who is a mamzer, who is a bastard, who belongs in the congregation and who does not. And there is quite a lot of clarity about who is allowed. No Ammonite or Moabite may ever be admitted into the congregation of God's people. Keep in mind that Lot is Abraham's nephew. Under normal circumstances, Lot's children should have belonged to God's people. There is a decision that's being made here about this part of the family tree. These people cannot belong. And what you see in red, the Moavi, the Ammonites and the Moabites, Ad Olam is a very powerful construction. It means for all eternity, right? Never are you allowed to have any human beings who themselves may be perfectly legitimate human beings in the congregation of the Lord. So not ever. Now, of course, we know there does come to be a kind of interesting exception, and we will look at her in a minute. But first, another place here where how are we describing and how are we setting up and imagining these people? And one of the really interesting things here is the way, and as I often do, I'll talk to you about what does the English say and what is the translation and what's really going on in the Hebrew. And what's really going on in the Hebrew with Vayachel is a little bit more than profaned. We're talking about pollution. We're talking about defilement. You should hear the sexualization going on here, right? You should hear and see the pollution that sex with these women will produce. And they are described not as Moabite women. This is key. They're described as the daughters of Moab. Do you see the difference? The daughters of Moab. They're called, a biblical author is dragging you back to that specific moment around the birth of Moab, to the story of Lot's rape, to the story of this incestuous thing. He's not just saying Moabite women, and there's a way to do that in Hebrew. He doesn't do it. So those are key elements about this. How does this sexualization go on? We often think of Ruth as that lovely, the lovely story, the sweet story in Bible. And I think I've spoken to you a little bit about the problems in this book, but I'm going to reframe them and rephrase them and repeat them. This whole set of passages, Ruth 2:8, where this is in chapter 2, when Ruth accidentally and magically finds herself in Boaz's field. Keeping in mind that Boaz has done absolutely nothing for his relatives who have shown up poor, hungry, and all the rest, right? But she accidentally, luckily, finds herself in his field, and Boaz sees her. Now, it is really important, a text that's not up here, that is, however, in chapter 2, is that Boaz comes to his young servant dude and says, hey, who's that young woman down there? And the servant also makes clear from the start, oh, that's Ruth the Moabitess. Okay, she is called and named as a Moabite no less than 5 times in these chapters. It gets repeated a lot. And by this time, you can figure out that being a Moabitess doesn't have the happiest associations. Has everybody got that? Okay. And, of course, he says to her, stay with my girls. And he says also, keep your eyes on the field. I've ordered the men not to molest you. That's a lovely, neutral way to translate what is actually going on. Yes, you're right. You knew Rabbi Barbara was going to go there because she will, right? And naga is the word here. It's used with a prepositional bet. I'm sure that means a lot to all of you. But trust me when I say that every time you see this verb together with the bet, it is related to sexualized violence of some sort or violence of some sort, right? It's a violent act. This is not about his workers molesting her. This is about them potentially attacking her. And as we all know from the situation with immigrants who work in the fields, being molested, being accosted, being raped is a constant hazard in our own country, in our own time. So we shouldn't be surprised that Boaz thinks it's a problem then too, right? And in the close of this, when Ruth goes home to tell her mother-in-law what happened, he even told me, stay close by my workers. She does not repeat, he told me to stay close by my girls, right? The biblical author is making sure here that you have a little bit of remembrance around this whole Moabitess thing, right? She's not as careful as she should be. She's not as mindful as she has to be taught. She has to be reminded what appropriate behavior is for a young woman, right? So there's that little kind of sound in the text. And then Naomi in the next chapter, this is interesting. I'm going to be blunt about this. She basically pimps Ruth. Dress up, anoint yourself, make yourself attractive, and she sends Ruth down, as we know, to the threshing floor where a bunch of drunken men have just finished their harvesting. Harvesting is known as like this big moment for celebration and often sex in the ancient world. We even see that in biblical texts. And tells her to go down and do all of these things, and then says, go and uncover his feet. Now, a curious aspect to this whole piece is that Naomi sometimes uses the first person, I will go down, rather than you will go down. Every time you see the parentheses and the brackets, that's showing you what is written in the text and what the Masoretic scribes replaced it with. So is Naomi having her own kind of projection here or not in the earlier text that we have received? Maybe. But in any case, she still sends Ruth into one of the most dangerous possible situations possible, and then she says, uncover Boaz's feet. How many of you know what the word foot is a euphemism for? I've mentioned this like 100 million times, right? So what is she supposed to uncover? So you can see that Ruth has been sexualized in a way that is a little bit anxious making. Her sexuality has been directed, it has been manipulated by others, and that she accedes to Naomi's plan without any kind of protest is also sexualizing her, right? Again, as a Moabitess. And that is something that we need to be thinking about, all these little overtones that come up. Now, in the end, Ruth is written out of the story in a way, as the Moabites in general are. The baby she produces is put in Naomi's lap. Naomi becomes the surrogate mother, and we never hear about Ruth ever again. So there is, on the one hand, a seeming act of redemption that King David even has a Moabitess as a grandmother, seems to go in contrast to those other texts. I don't want to deny that we've got some internal debate and arguing going on with the biblical authors about the position of the Moabites. And where does this go on? Bestialization and dehumanization. I'm going to give you another example. I'm staying with the Moabites because I think they give you a clear example. So we have a moment where in Judges 3, we're introduced to King Eglon, who is the king of Moab. He's very fat. His name means calf. Calf, a sacrificial animal, right? Eglon means calf. So that's something we want to think about. He's very fat, and his name is the name of an animal. He is pictured sitting in a particular room. Now the English is the cool upper chamber. Is there anybody who wants to guess what the Hebrew is telling you that this cool upper chamber is? A meat locker. Well, in Israel, you'd probably put that on the ground level. A toilet. Who said it? Thank you very much. He is likely sitting on a different kind of throne. Right? And this text is meant for its audience to laugh. Ha ha ha, King Moab, right? The king of all these people who have subdued the Israelites is sitting on the toilet, right? And what happens to this very fat man? You can see how they're being dehumanized and how they're being bestialized. And what happens? Ehud comes in, the leader of the Israelites, and he carries with him a very particular kind of sword, a gomed. There's an Arabic cognate with this word that has made biblical authors sit up and take notice, and that cognate means hard. And the word for the hilt in the Hebrew is a word that means erect. This is, by the way, the kind of thing that my students are going, oh, God, not again. She's doing this again. I mean, although the two students who are here are probably going, oh, this is fine, right? But some of them are freaking out, and you might be freaking out. But the sexual association here, again, the sexualization, the bestialization, right, the dehumanization are all part and parcel. Eglon is effectively, metaphorically, raping Eglon with his sword while he sits on a toilet, and you can notice what happens is that the hilt, this piece that says erect, goes in after the blade, so that's how deeply Eglon is penetrated. You want to think about that? And what happens? All this filth comes out, right? So these are things that we have to think through around what is happening here. Sexual language is being coupled with bestialization and dehumanization to ridicule and discredit foreigners, right? To legitimize what happens to them. And this will lay a foundation for further derogatory devaluations of these people that will be readily sanctioned and condoned and accepted by the reader, both ancient and modern. We accept it too, right? We just read the Israelites are the good guys and the Moabites are the bad guys. So here, the Moabites actually end up being depicted as a kind of, through Eglon, feminized, penetrated like a woman. Moab is, the text goes on, subdued under the hand of Israel. Hand, a euphemism again for, right. So, Part 2. This is David, who so many are taught to believe was the great, wonderful, pious king. He defeats the Moabites, makes them lie down on the ground like beasts. Make them lie down on the ground. They are no longer able to stand. You are making them into animals on the ground, helpless animals. And what does he do? Measures them off. And he measures off 2/3 of those Moabites to be put to death and 1/3 to be enslaved. And that's what happens. Tributary vassals is BS translation, okay? What happens to the Moabites and other peoples that David conquers is that they become his servants, they become his slaves. And that is typical in the ancient world. This next text from Psalm 60:10, Moab would be my wash basin, or on Edom I would cast my shoe. I'd like to point out that this washpot piece is associated also with texts in which excrement is washed away and with lavatories. Again, you can see the kind of languaging, the crude, painful languaging that is going on here. You can look that languaging up in Isaiah 4:4. I think what we're going to see now is so obvious it bears little explanation. Essentially, Moab is supposed to be ravaged. 48:42. Moab shall be destroyed as a people. Now we're looking at the kind of genocidal approaches to your enemies. You're going to destroy them as a people. Moab, Me'am, as a people, they're going to be destroyed. And Moab will become like Sodom, Ammonites like Gomorrah, right? It's desolation everywhere. The remnant of my people will plunder them. The remainder of my people, of my nation, shall possess them. I think you get the idea. It's important to know how true these texts are to our time, how much they tell us about the ways that women experience war in our time. So let's look at this. And you see among the captives, right, you go to war, a beautiful woman, and you desire her and would take her to wife. Bring her into your house. She shall trim her hair, pare her nails, and discard her captive's garb. She shall spend a month's time in your house, lamenting her father and mother. After that you may come to her and go into her, and she shall be your wife. Then should you no longer want her, you must release her outright. You must not sell her for money. Since you had your will of her, or humbled her, you must not enslave her. Now, on the face of it, some of you might say, oh, we're regulating the horrors that an Israeli soldier can inflict on a captive woman who comes from another ethnic community. But I'd like to take this text apart a little bit. So first of all, trim her hair? Really? The Hebrew is to be bald, to shave. She's to shave off all her hair. Now, I don't know about you, but I have associations with women's heads being shaved. And it doesn't take just being Jewish to have those associations. We remember what happened to French women after World War II, who had any relationship or were suspected of having any relationship with Germans. How do you humiliate a woman? Immediately, shave their hair off. And then, she strips. She has to take off her clothes. Right? Let's think about this. In whose company does she have to take off her clothes? In front of whom does this happen? Again, my associations are pretty powerful. Shave the head, stripping, talking about dehumanization on a grand scale. And then what appears to be a pleasant, oh, you're going to give her a month to mourn the fact that she has witnessed the destruction of her family, that she has just survived the greatest kind of trauma, only to be embedded in another trauma. You wait a month's time for her to do that. Why would any man wait a month's time to do such a thing? Right, to make sure she's not pregnant, right? So that you make certain that once you have your will of her, any child that is the result is yours and not some other man's. She shall be your wife. I want you to ask yourself, is any woman taken like this? Does the title of wife work for them? Do you want to think about the Yazidi women who were taken and forced into marriage? The Boko Haram, who did the same with women and girls? You want to think about whether they thought, oh, well, now that you call me wife, I guess this is okay, what's happening to me. It is not okay. It is not okay. And then, if you don't want her anymore, you have to release her. Now, first of all, I want to point out that the word that's translated, you had your will of her, humbled her, is a word that comes up repeatedly in rape texts of the Hebrew Bible. The word is anah. There is no one-to-one word for rape in Hebrew Bible, but there are sets of words that are used in that context. Anah is one of them. So even the author is finding it, yeah, you can just take her. This is, in fact, what has happened. And I also want to ask you to think about a woman who might be released into a hostile community, certainly not friendly, of Israelites who have battled her people and subdued them, and she's told, all right, you don't have to be my wife anymore, you can go free. How does she support herself? How does she find a way through? Think about the dangers of that, right? So despite the fact that scholars for years saw this as, oh, well, this is an advance, this is showing us, like, legislating things in a way that are better than they could have been, I would take a look at that and say, from whose perspective, oh, male, white, heterosexual scholar? Because often those were the scholars who made such claims. You try being the woman in this place, put yourself in her position, and ask yourself whether this works that way. I want to point out that this is not the only time this happens. That women are taken as captives for sexual use occurs in these texts. Some of my students are going to be having to face what happens in these later Judges texts. And the Bring Back Our Girls, you know what I'm referring to, right? I want you to understand how real this is. It's happening as I speak to you. Racism and othering is not a thing of the past. Every single one of these things that I'm discussing is happening as I speak to you. I am not going to lie. The region that I spoke of, all of this is happening. All of this is happening on both sides, on all sides, helping to justify horrific violence. The language that people use about other human beings, I hope to God you're not reading it. I have been for a week. What's happening in our texts is happening now. And if we can't see it in our texts, we'll never see it around us now. That's why I teach it. Because I want my students to see how old this is, how real this is. I don't want them to brush through these texts anymore. And they're the same texts that tell us this. The stranger who resides with you shall be to you as one of your own. You shall love him as yourself. You were strangers in the land of Egypt. I am Adonai your God. My friends, I may spend all of my time with you all the time talking about the worst of these texts, because I don't want you to cherry pick the pretty stuff and say, oh, I'm content with that. I'm good with that. I don't have to pay attention to the rest. You have to hold these things together. You have to know they exist together. You have to examine them. And you have to ask yourself, where am I avoiding? Where am I colluding? Where am I permitting? Because I am not naming. I'm going to close with this statement, and then we will have a little time to comment. No, I'm going to close with a prayer. And I'm going to ask you to do something unusual, y'all, because I know your tradition is to do this. Bow your head, close your eyes. No, I want you to look up and look at each other and look at the people around you while we pray. May we be aware that, as in my tradition it is said, God has 70 faces. The faces of God are everywhere in this room. May we be aware that we ourselves, in acting godly, in bringing our capacity to love, our capacity for compassion, our capacity for understanding into the world, are in fact acting as the hands of God, the heart of God, the soul of God, and the very purpose of God. And may we say amen. So I have a microphone, and I'm not afraid to use it. We'll pass this around to whoever has questions, comments, reactions, and see what you have to say. And you know I'm going to tell you, be shy in your own time. Right? This is my time. I know that some of you do have to leave for the other service. May you be blessed. Say that a little bit. Ken, say it again.
It's just like we haven't learned. It's the history of the Middle East. I mean, it's been that way, and we've followed it, and we still do.
It's not just the Middle East.
And because it's everywhere, and it's something we have to be aware of, and we have to address it as individuals.